Thank you very much for having me today. The year was 2016, I believe, and I was staring out the window. I had been hired into a new job within the same company that I worked at a year prior, and spent about a year of my first year on the job laying people off. We had to reduce around 30% of our workforce, and that was pretty much my job. Everybody hated me. You could see it on the internet. And isn't technology great? And I sat there looking out the window thinking, this isn't working. Either I needed to go get a new job, and my kids were in school and I didn't really want to move. I kind of like New Mexico. Or we needed to figure out something different to do because our business model wasn't working. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we do before we get there. And so I stared out the window and I was depressed. I was seeing therapists and popping pills, legal ones. And I looked at it and said, we have to change almost completely our business model and what we're doing. And we have to pivot the organization to do something completely different to grow. So I Googled something that I thought we should do. And I looked it up, and I phoned a couple of friends. I'm a scientist by training. I'm kind of crappy at business, but I figured it out over time. And so I figured out what we needed to do was better engage with the community within the biotechnology community, which was a pivot from what our lab had traditionally done, which was working within the federal sector. And so I went to my boss, who's the CEO of the company, and I said, boss, we got two choices. Start planning to shut the lab down in a couple of years, or change the name of the company, change our pricing structure, change our business model, evolve the staff into staff that are willing to pivot to a commercially viable entity and move in a completely different direction. And he said, so those are my two choices. And I said, yeah, that's pretty much your two choices. And so here we are. And so we invested and looked at, we were the Loveless Respiratory Research Institute. We had formed as a private nonprofit. Yeah, I made a presentation, but it's kind of boring, so I'm just going to go a cappella. We formed this nonprofit called the Loveless Respiratory Research Institute in the mid-90s. And there was an idea to build it as a nonprofit biomedical entity and bring in money from wherever and have sort of like a mini university foundation in a state that you get very little support from. We have no grateful donors. We have no subsidies from universities or from the state like you would if I lived in Texas or if I lived anywhere else. And so everything is completely on our own in terms of bringing in soft money to make a business work, of which a business that we have a biomedical research lab with 3 campuses, an overhead of around $20 to $25 million, and no way we were going to do it unless we pivoted. So we changed the name from Respiratory Research Institute because that was very, it isolated us in terms of the discipline that we are working into. We evolved it to a more broad-based organization called Loveless Biomedical, which focuses more broadly on the biomedical research entity and what the needs are within the biomedical research community. And we completely changed our pricing structure and how we went about business. And we went from a bunch of scientists going and standing around at a meeting next to a booth and talking to people to creating a systematic marketing and business development infrastructure that's built on CRMs and professional business development people with a strategy. And that all sounds great. I had to figure that out. So I called somebody up that had done it before. And I said, Carlos was his name. I said, Carlos, here's kind of what I want to do, but I have no idea what I'm doing, and you've done this before, so can you help me? Carlos said, sure, 20 grand, I'll come by and talk to you. So Carlos came by, And he had done this before, and this is to build a contract research laboratory that was focused in the biomedical sector and growing it, because in the mid 90s, most large biotech pharmaceutical companies were doing most of their work in-house, but then that shifted. By the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, the contract research organization model has started to really flourish. It had been around for decades, but it really didn't flourish until that time because large pharma decided they wanted to outsource. And so that started to develop. We weren't doing it. We were trying to get federal dollars. We were out here while everyone else was growing and doing this. We were doing this other model. And so we wanted to figure out and try and get out a piece. Carlos in 2007 had built a business and did this. So he showed me how to develop a strategic plan, to identify what the elements are of your business for developing that strategic plan and how to implement that through the budgeting and other processes, and really to apply the entrepreneurial process to organizational change. And so we did this, we developed this, and through the hard work of a lot of people that helped contribute to this, we went from, in 2017, we changed the name to Loveless Biomedical, and I hired a marketing firm to make cute logos and stuff like this, and started in 2018 through 2023. In 2017, our commercial revenue was $12 million, which was basically static from what we had been the past 3 or 4 years. And in 2022, our commercial revenue was $50 million. So we were able to increase a factor of 5 over that period of time through a lot of hard work and through pivoting and introducing and growing our capacity. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the organization, how we did that, but also who we are and what the history is of the organization and how it exists. And so why am I here at Bio today? Anyways, our client base, we do work to help develop technology. The technology that we help to develop is in the pharmaceutical space. We look to take molecules, drugs, therapeutics from a concept where an innovator company has them in a certain stage, and we take them from that stage and advance them to IND status, which means that they can go into the clinic and be evaluated for safety and efficacy in humans. We utilize animal models as a model to evaluate efficacy and safety. We do that utilizing a number of different technologies. These are all regulated through the FDA, the USDA, to the CDC, and a number of different entities that help govern and dictate what we do. Our primary laboratory is actually based out on the Air Force Base for historical reasons that I'll tell you in just a moment. But we utilize that. We own a swath of land that is completely our own on an island out there on the very end of the Air Force Base. We have to use the kids with the M16s or whatever the hell they shoot these days, and drive past them as an easement to get to our laboratory, but we own it at this point. And we utilize that facility that was built in 1967 for this purpose. Our primary target audience in terms of the people that we work with are small to medium companies. Typically people who they're ready, they know their technology is vetted, they've gotten their first round of funding, or we work with them to get funding through an SBIR or STTR or some other technology, and they're ready to move it towards through that piece. Usually we don't bid on anything under $50,000, and we usually are an average contract size around $200,000 to $300,000. An average program to get an IND is around $1 million to $2 million. So in the contract research space, there's a bunch of annoying acronyms, but the point is we actually have a specific niche. And I'm going to go into some of this detail because it gives you a little bit of history of New Mexico. And it's actually, there's some things about the lab that are actually, people in New Mexico tend to be, they have a phenotype of being proud and insular, and they like to have things that they can be proud of. There's something, and so I'm going to give you a few things that you can be proud of about this organization, because we often don't jump up and down about the organization in town here because there's no money in New Mexico. Every dollar comes from out of state, so we don't spend a lot of time in town typically. But we have a pretty large laboratory, about 350,000 square feet of space. We have over 400 employees in this space. Around probably 60 to 70 are terminal degree people. I mean, probably more than that. About 100 of them are terminal degree people, PhD, master's level, and the rest are bachelor's level folks of varying disciplines. We say there's a single site because a lot of the people we compete with are basically conglomerates of labs that have entities all around the world. And so we're small in the entity. There's the contract research business that we work in globally is around a $5 to $6 billion industry in the non-clinical side. And like I tell my friends at the big labs, we just want what falls off the truck, which is big for us, but small for them. So we're a small company, but we have a lot of big ability when it comes to being able to look and identify a lot of problems and solve those. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So this past, during the pandemic, we have a lot of experience and history with respiratory disease. We used to be called the Inhalation Toxicology Research Institute. Some of you have been around long enough to know that back in the 80s, that was our name. And the reason was because in 1967, the laboratory was established here by the government to build a lab out in the desert that was focused on addressing the issue of understanding the effects, the human health effects of radionuclides and ultimately of energy production. And so they built a lab and they wanted it to be on government property. So it ended up being put out on the middle of the desert, out on an Air Force base. And the Atomic Energy Commission built a laboratory, and they built it to be able to assess these issues with a focus in New Mexico on respiratory disease. So we built an infrastructure. We developed the first people who understood and did the first lung transplant in an animal, the first successful lung transplant in a beagle dog. We established one of the first and only laboratories in the country. There were several, but we were one of the pioneering laboratories to build and understand biology of the beagle dog and its ability to be used to represent human disease. And that was one of the major infrastructures here in New Mexico. There were no ways to measure physiology like we do when we go to the doctor and we try to understand what happens to our own bodies. There was no way to do that in animal models to be able to predict this. We had to invent them. There were no ways, there was aerosol talk earlier. There were limited technologies relative to aerosol technology, especially applied to this discipline. And so Tom Mercer and many other founding aerosol scientists came there in a multidisciplinary arena, working with radiobiologists and others to build an infrastructure to understand and characterize for about 20 to 30 years, to build our understanding in the state and in the world about the health consequences of inhaled radionuclides. And that went on for about 20 or 30 years, and it created an infrastructure in a laboratory that we can then today have these types of models and these types of expertise. And so what we were able to do because of that expertise is during the pandemic, we became quite popular. We have a specialized capability in respiratory disease. Respiratory disease is often goes hand in hand with infectious disease. We know how to develop drugs. We know how to evaluate them, and we know how to pivot and work under containment. So we, during the pandemic, worked with many of the drugs that you guys are aware of, many of the vaccines. We worked with remdesivir, the Gilead drug. We work with a lot of the monoclonal antibodies. And what does that mean? Pfizer, Gilead, these large companies would come to us and say, I know you guys have this capability. We need to develop this rapidly. We need to understand how to be able to evaluate efficacy, that is, does a drug work? And then we need to rapidly be able to adapt this drug and develop this into the clinic. So an example using our expertise was there was a desire to use an inhaled remdesivir formulation. When people take remdesivir, they take it as an IV, and they're looking, and we also work with them on pills, et cetera. And so we developed a model working with a biosafety level 3 challenge where we would take SARS, which is the virus that causes COVID, and we would challenge this in a non-human primate model to create a model to replicate actually human phenotype conditions of COVID, which is really, in animal models, COVID is kind of like a teenager getting. They don't really have a expressed phenotype because they don't have a lot of susceptibilities that make you susceptible to COVID. So what we were mostly looking at is viral replication and whether or not a drug could treat that and remove it. So Gilead contacted us, can you develop this model? Of course, we developed this model. Working under containment, they paid us to do this, great. We showed this, we utilized their drug, applied this formulation, applied it in a specialized system that can do aerosols, and then took that drug and then did the requisite toxicology studies that allow you to take it and get through to show that it's safe and to show that it's efficacious. So we showed that the drug worked. It was equal or better than IV. We showed that it was safe. We showed that and did that in a very rapid time. In about 8 months, we went from concept to basically in the clinic, evaluating within COVID patients. And we did that with Lilly. We did that with a number of different clients. And that's an example of the type of things we do within our business model that take advantage of the history that we have, and particularly in the biotechnology sector. And so the areas that we work in are toxicology, is something safe or not, bioanalytical, I need to measure something. We do a lot of work in gene therapy, gene and cell therapy, or regenerative medicine. A lot of that is because as we've gotten involved with the biotech community, we have to follow the money. And there's been a lot of investment over the past 5 years, starting around 2012, so 10 years, starting around 2012, and it's just ramped up every year within that community. And luckily, we had a lot of credibility in that area, and we're able to take advantage of that. Custom pharmacology means does a drug work, respiratory work. In about 2000 or so, St. Pete established a place called the Mind Research Network here, which is over on the UNM campus. That lasted for around 10, 12 years or so. And they focus mostly on clinical, but some non-clinical neurological disorders, as well as research about addiction and psychopathy and another thing, but they're neuro folks. And in 2010, they combined with us, and we have been able to spin and pivot to do a lot of work now beyond respiratory into neuroscience, utilizing a lot of their capabilities. And so now we're doing a lot of clinical work, but also in looking at everything from Alzheimer's, alternative to pain, looking at opiate addiction issues, opiate-induced respiratory distress with partners across the biotech industry as well as in the federal government. And we do a lot of work also in medical countermeasures. We heard a little bit about that earlier today, talking about biodefense. We are the only laboratory in the world that has capabilities that span the entire CBRNE range, which means chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, radiological weapons, and also explosive. We have laboratory capabilities in-house that do and span and have expertise to address and build and develop knowledge around all of those. And we are among the largest, still because of our history, and one of the leading laboratories in the world still to study the potential countermeasures and consequences of exposure to both external and internal radiation. And so we are recognized in the world, I would say. Of course, it's a relatively small pond, but in the world, I would say we are at least one of the top couple laboratories in the world for respiratory drug development and applying and doing what we do. There's maybe one other lab in the world that can do what we do. And with respect to the medical countermeasures, there's really no other entity that is as good as us, especially in the radiation area, but also that has this type of diversity. And so we're proud of this, and we're proud of these accomplishments. And I'm going to jump over some annoying stuff. And so the laboratory itself was built 70 years ago. It was originally tied, it was an offshoot to the Lovelace Health System. They wanted to diversify their income, and they wanted to keep Randy Lovelace engaged because he was a hotshot young doctor. And so they did that, and they wrote a proposal to the Atomic Energy Commission to build this lab in the middle of the desert for what I said. They won it. holy crap. And they started to do that, but in the early 80s, the hospital system, which is very good at being a managed healthcare organization, became completely separate from the Loveless Biomedical Research Foundation and the research entity, which was originally designed as trying to model the Mayo Clinic model, which is basically physician researchers working together to accomplish and work as well as deliver healthcare. But eventually those split out for a variety of reasons. And so we've been a completely independent entity since the early 80s. We did garner through a number of machinations and endowment as part of that of around, depending on the stock market, anywhere from $50 to $80 million. But we utilize that mostly for leverage, not for any direct costs. And so the entity's been around for a long time. At any given time, every 10 years or so, we think about whether or not it's time to shut it down or grow, and we reinvent ourselves. And we're still here. And we're proud of that as well. And we have a lot of specialized capabilities, and these are the things that we do. We have a bunch of people. This is the facility. When you take off from the airport, if you're flying east and you bank and you're kind of banking and you look out at the end of the base and you see this bunch of buildings that look like something in the middle of nowhere, that's us. I drive 12 miles on the base every day, but that is our land, damn it. And it actually took an act of Congress, because originally it was owned by the government, but we got it from them, and they deeded it to us, and for better or worse, it's ours. And we do a bunch of stuff. We have a bunch of things. We do a bunch of stuff, and that's unimportant. So basically, there's a couple of areas that we're really well known for, and we've tried to diversify and broaden the areas that we meet into, because we have to follow the money, and we've done that, and we're constantly looking at what's going on within bio, what's going on with the business sector, and how can we adapt our capabilities through hiring or strategic initiatives, through integration, and through other ways to try and build and maintain business that is constantly evolving. And we had this opportunity because the gene therapy, I thought, was a complete flyer. It was kind of weird. They had it in the 90s. We're going to change your genes and we're going to make you healthier or whatever. And, someone died in the late 90s on a clinical trial. And then that was kind of a buzzkill for a few years. And so nobody was doing anything. And then it started to kind of ramp back up because they figured what was going on. And then by 2007, the NIH wanted to invest money in it. So they established a center for gene therapy. And it was at University of Pennsylvania and Loveless. And we had a scientist that was doing this, and I was kind of doing something else at the time. I thought, but that's stupid. Why are we doing that? And so we had this center, and we were the lab that when there was a discovery at a university that was funded through the NIH, that discovery within that discipline would come to us. There was no private money really being invested at this time in 2007. And through 2007 through 2012, there really wasn't anything going on. But if you look at the funding within the biotech sector, starting in 2012, every year, all the way until the last few years, we're reaching the B number in terms of the amount of investment every year that's going into gene therapy. And we just happen to have this credibility. And that worked really well for us because we were able to use it in this situation where I was coming out of my depression. I realized that we had to be something other than this respiratory lab. We had to have something else we could even talk about. And I spent a couple of years being embarrassed about who we are. And then the next couple of years going like this, saying, yeah, we do respiratory for obvious reasons, but we had this to build on as an anchor, and that was really great. And we did a lot of things that gave us credibility. But in the respiratory side, even though we wanted to diversify, we have done some really interesting things. We have partnered with a number of companies. This is an example of, we've done a suite of these that we did a drug all the way from initial concept, working with a small biotech, Pearl Therapeutics, a few people in a garage. They got some funding, friends and family at first. They raised some money. They contacted us. We worked with them on how to adapt and build their formulation into something that would work. And their formulation, how do you put the drug into something that actually someone can inhale? And so we worked back and forth on them, and we came up with something, working with them back and forth, and we started to do studies to advance and develop their technology. This was around 2008 or so, and there was a big push within the pharmaceutical sector, and many of you have these medications now, to basically take people who were on multiple respiratory medications, you had multiple inhalers, and figure out how to do co-formulations where you could put multiple drugs in the same thing. And so Pearl had created this great idea where they could take suspended particles and stick them inside a pressurized meter dose inhaler. And those suspended particles had different physical chemical properties. And so they could take drugs of different solubilities and glom onto them under different microenvironments inside a pressurized meter dose inhaler and make this work. And so we worked back and forth with them to make this work. They raised some money. We started to do some studies that showed that this worked. We started to do some safety studies to advance this along. And we did this for several years. Then Pearl got bought for $1 billion by AstraZeneca. And it's a good story. So then we were working with Astra and Pearl. We developed Bevespi, and we developed a number of other combination therapies that are now on the clinic. And there's nothing more rewarding than having to work in this environment and see someone pull out their medication that you worked on from the very beginning and say, okay, it wasn't all for nothing. And so we're proud of those accomplishments. And it's not, when I first started working there, we didn't do a lot of work in the bio sector. We did stuff and we would write papers, and that can be rewarding because it was more kind of basic science and things like that. But I was like, man, I'm going to go into construction. At least at the end of it, they have a house. They built something. They can show that there's something that exists. I have a paper no one's going to read. But in this sector, you can see I have a product. I have something that's going to benefit society. And all of you here, the few entrepreneurs I've been able to engage with this morning a little bit, they're all doing things. They're all taking risks and trying to build and make a difference. And it's hard. It takes guts, and it's amazing. So we did a bunch of things. There's some braggy things around it, but in New Mexico, you have this lab, which is historically one of the most accomplished laboratories in the entire world in the respiratory disease space. We've pioneered pulmonary physiology measurement equipment and how that's done. Most of the commercial labs that sell that today were stealing our ideas for how we developed them back in the 80s and 90s. We serve the scientific community. Many of us, myself included, have served on the National Academy of Science panels and try and be engaged directly within the scientific community to be able to help out and work in that arena. We do a lot of work to help and work with companies to help identify and build funding. And we do a lot of work in different types of models. We were talking earlier about some work being done over here in allergy. I don't know about you guys, but I get allergies. I take shots. I spend a lot of money. We did a lot of work. We have a canine model that gets allergies, and you can actually challenge them, and they get allergies, and it can mimic human allergic response, both through respiratory responses as well as others. And so have you guys seen the Ensure, the drink that you guys drink? Abbott sells this, and they identified a protein that's in mother's breast milk that they identified and said that this actually helps with allergic response and helps build the immune system. And we did a lot of studies over time to show and optimize the formulation that is currently used in Ensure, that and we utilize these allergic dog models to look at different scenarios where we give them these different proteins that are mimicked after what is identified and based on the protein profile in human breast milk, and utilize this model that was adapted here in New Mexico in the 1980s for this. And today we have a number of different studies ongoing in the veterinary space to look at atopic dermatitis and ways to get sort of what I call itchy syndrome. And we're doing many studies on that. And there's a number of different areas just that of stuff that we're being opportunistic about to be involved with. And so ultimately, the organization, I've talked enough about this stuff. The organization is built to try and understand the needs of the biotech community and within New Mexico to survive. We are a service organization. We eat what we kill, and the way we kill it is through hopefully doing good work, identifying a client base, and building within that client base so that we can advance from there. But what's different now, I'd say that now we when I first got into trying to sort of pivot what we were doing, I mentioned earlier that we had a challenge because we were mostly doing federal work. The problem with working with the government in our sector is because we don't get an endowment from the government. Everything is sort of with grants. Is money is politically driven, and so you could be over here. The reason why we had to change our complete financial infrastructure was because of Ebola. We were doing a bunch of work and getting a lot of funding, and then Ebola occurred, and all of the money went to Ebola. So all of a sudden now we are sitting here going, okay, well, what about this important stuff we were doing? It didn't matter. And so it got to a point where I said, okay, we can live with that. And I don't mind working with the government. The monies can be good, but you can't have that as your primary business model when they can make a $5 to $10 million shift in a matter of minutes. And so the other thing is, in working with the government, those of you who have, they're not always in a hurry to get stuff done. And so it's important, I have found, to work with people who are in a hurry to get stuff done. The biotechnology sector are driven by pressure. They're driven by, I have money I need to spend so that I can reach a milestone. And if you don't reach that milestone, then you're dead. Those are the types of people I want to work with, because we want to do work. Because if we do work, we hopefully make an impact to society, and we hopefully generate revenue so that we can keep the lights on. And this is why it's been a good pivot for us. And so what do I want out of bio? I love to meet people, and I love New Mexico, and I love to interact with folks in here, and perhaps maybe we could work together. But hopefully from our organization, we can continue to partner with how to look at how bio can help us on the national stage, where we go to national meetings and get our name out there. We're still trying to get our name out there into the biotechnology sector and get out there. It's a slog. And so we're trying to get our name out there against right now. I started in a moment of stupidity, started a diagnostic business a few years ago in New Mexico. Don't ever try and start a diagnostic business in New Mexico. Tricor will eat your lunch. And so that was stupid, but add it to the list. But we are the equivalent in the broader sense, because if you look at it right now, there's Covance, which is LabCorp, and there's another laboratory, Charles River, and they own 95% of the market. And basically, we're sort of like the local hardware store, and they're Home Depot and Lowe's. And so we still have to get our name out there and find partners. And when I first started doing this, it's like, I have like 10 friends. I need 1,000, and it's a slog, and we need help, from a bio, if we can, to be able to get our name out there and help build, because we don't talk about it much, but in a sense, with 400 employees and a private entity doing biotechnology in New Mexico, I would view us as an anchor within the state. And I think, but we're not as big as we'd like to be, and we'd like to continue to grow. So I'm going to tell you about something completely different. So about 2 years ago, Loveless, which has been a standalone private entity for a number of years, started to engage in talks to look at, I think my boss was tired of being too small and stressed out all the time, so he wanted to find an uncle. And so he started looking for uncles all around. We almost did a deal with National Jewish, where we were going to basically merge with them and be kind of sort of an entity as part of them, and that fell through for a couple of reasons. We even tried locally in New Mexico. We begged for money at the Roundhouse. That didn't go very far. We actually tried with the local universities. That didn't pan out for a variety of reasons. And so, long story short, we met what has become a match with an entity based out of New York called Toro University. And Toro University started about 20, 30 years ago as a small Jewish-serving undergraduate entity who has then evolved over the course of the last 20 years or so into a broad education administering organization that has about 10 medical schools all around the country, mostly DO, some MD, and also overseas as well. And our sister organization within that entity is New York Medical College, and then a number of schools all around the country. And so we are now a subsidiary of Toro University. And so now we're part of a $700 million entity as opposed to a $70 million entity. And so there's some advantage to that in terms of financial stability, and that's good. Why does that matter to any of you guys? So Toro is interested in investing in New Mexico, and they're looking at and trying to evaluate currently the potential of actually building and establishing a dental school here in Albuquerque. And there's not another dental school. It wouldn't compete with the universities, which is a prerequisite. And we're going through the machinations of that currently, and they have the money, and they've established dental schools in other regions. And this would actually, in its first inception, be basically a continuation of a current dental school that's in New York. And so students would have the opportunity to go to New York for their first 2 years of coursework, and then come back out here for their clinicals and administer and work with local dentists here as part of the dynamic in terms of how we would support that clinicals, and have some that we would hire here. And so hopefully that would be another infusion into the biotech community within New Mexico, and also be an opportunity for job creation here as well. So I will shut up now.
Questions? Oh, over there. Go ahead.
Hi. Do you have a handbook or a Cliff Notes for your pivot? Or maybe there was some school of thought that books that you recommend.
It was outside of your.
Well, what's the old saying? You know, half the money that I spend on marketing, I don't know if it does any good, and the other one, I don't know any better. You know, I have no idea. You know, in terms of marketing, it was really critical for us to change our name and to sort of pivot, because everywhere I went, you know, marketing I view as a matter of basically human manipulation for them to understand and view you in the way you want to be viewed. It's noise and it's all that other stuff, and it's pretty pictures and handouts, take some, and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, every time I would go to a meeting, oh, you're that lab out there that does government work, and I've heard you guys are slow and expensive. That was my legacy: slow, expensive government work. And so ultimately, I had to pivot away from that, change the name, and then start pretending that that other entity never existed. I don't even know who they are. And so the actual, I think, real leap that was important to get there was in hiring some people within the business development enterprise that created structure so that they could get people in front of them and scientists in front of people. And that really helped. But the other thing that was also very important was intellectual turnover. The world of gene therapy, the world of science, it's a young person's game. And so ultimately, we had gone into a situation now where a lot of these companies, I walked into, there's several situations. I walked into a business, Boston, and I look around the room and I'd look at some, I made this stupid mistake several times. I'd look at some senior gentleman or whatever, and I'd say, hi, are you the CEO? And no, some 25-year-old woman would walk in. Oh, that's me. I'm like, God damn, I'm an idiot. And I learned quickly, it's multi-genders, it's young people, it's this, that, and the other. They have no idea who I used to be. This is great. And so it was basically starting fresh. And you had a new sector of people who didn't really understand and recollect your institutional memory that created this legacy. So that really helped. And so all of them, so the marketing certainly helped, but I hate to give marketing companies too much credit. Sorry if you work with one. So.
You had that good example of the inhaler company starting in someone's garage. I bet you've seen a lot of bad examples too. Just curious what you thought, maybe something you see early on with those companies where you know they're going to be successful, or if you can kind of, any characteristics you can tell.
I can tell you, I've seen the beauty of working in the contract research world is you see the cutting edge. You see so many technologies, you see so many amazing things, and you see a lot of things where you're like, holy crap, that's never going to do anything. And I can tell you, I've seen probably hundreds of them, and I have no ability to predict success or not. Because I can tell you, I've seen companies who have been remarkably successful with technology that's horrible, and I've seen people with great technology that never went anywhere. And I think a lot of the success comes through who is your leadership, who are the contacts that they have that can help give them credibility, and who are the people that they know within their network that they can vet. And so if I went to school in Boston, or if I did some of these other things, it weighs disproportionately well, oftentimes, compared with the technology. And so this is why you see a lot of people trying to span out from those colleges. And there's a lot of politics in the game of growth of small businesses and in garnering of funding, is my observation. And that's all I can say.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Can you may have covered this briefly, but how did you get to where you were in this situation? What was your career path prior to getting into the situation where you were popping pills and trying to figure out what the future of your life looked like, as well as the company?
Well, I think I came to New Mexico in 1999. I was just a scientist, coming in, working at the benches, and I outlasted everybody else, I guess, and kind of started managing people and this, that, and the other. And I was, within any corporate structure, some people are better at navigating it than others, and I happen to be okay and have some reasonably good success in the world in the world of you eat what you kill. The people who are successful are the people who bring in money. And so I've had success in bringing in funding, and usually that kind of leads some sort of responsibilities. And so I learned how to write and build and understand and look at money flows, and that kind of built up into a situation. And then, the way the organization was built, I was still reasonably young, and the senior leadership within our organization, there was a gap just because of the way the entity occurred in the company. So those people retired, And I looked around and said, I guess that guy has to deal with this. And I was just okay. And so I ended up in that situation. But I think from the people who are the students, in terms of trying to look at it, what I look at in terms of people who want to build their careers and be in management or do things if you aspire to that, it's developing the capability to be diverse in your own skill set, not just what you do at the bench, but also how you can understand what drives that particular organization. Believe it or not, people who can speak reasonably well, I think I do okay, get listened to more than people who are equally good or better, but they don't get recognized as much. And that is a human failure because, and I realized this because when I was in college, I couldn't stand in front of people. And so I joined Toastmaster. I think one of my Toastmasters friends is actually, is here. I joined because I couldn't talk to people. I wouldn't even stand up in front of people. And I realized over the course of my career, I only realized this a few years ago because I have a son who's really poor at speaking. And I look at him and go, he's never going to get an opportunity because people get differential treatment if they speak well in front of other people. It's unfair, but it's life. And so those are the types of things that kind of led to my situation and being in that position at that time. And I had great mentorship. I think ultimately the organization had some spectacular people who did these things that I bragged about, but ultimately most of it was other people who actually did it. And learning and building from what they built over the years, and then being able to kind of assimilate that and take what they did and try and build from it as best we could. And ultimately, the growth and the build of all of this stuff was certainly not me. I was just trying to cheerlead and lead this. It was a group of very talented people that helped identify and create this success.